It all started with a whisper from Brussels, a leak so small it could have been dismissed, but the words inside carried the weight of an economic bombshell. Behind closed doors, Donald Trump, standing before NATO allies, delivered a chilling demand. Raise tariffs on Africa. Make them bend or watch them starve. The target was clear. Africa's raw lifeblood, oil and gold. Two resources without which Western economies would stumble overnight. Trump feared that if BRICS locked these resources, Washington's grip on the global order would shatter. For Africa, the message was brutal. Either surrender sovereignty or face economic suffocation. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't tremble. He called it what it was, economic warfare disguised as diplomacy. And instead of silence, he prepared fire. What came next would shake Africa, NATO, and the world itself. The leak was never random. It came from inside the very room where the decision was made. During a closed-door meeting in Brussels, Washington pressed its allies hard, raised tariffs on Africa, cut them off until they returned to dependence. The message was blunt, and the targets were clear. Africa's oil and gold, the lifeblood of entire economies, the twin resources without which Western industries would stumble overnight. Most European leaders stayed silent, but not all. Among them sat one who couldn't bury his conscience. He knew what such a move would mean. Economic warfare disguised as diplomacy. A new cycle of suffering forced onto millions. Yet speaking out publicly would have been political suicide. So a different choice was made. Late that night, a single page from the classified memo slipped quietly into the hands of an anonymous European journalist. Not through official channels, not for power, but as an act of quiet resistance. The journalist's report was short, but explosive. Washington had pushed Europe to secretly prepare tariffs designed to choke Africa's oil and gold exports, forcing the continent to kneel. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré didn't see it as rumor. He saw it for what it was, a declaration of war on Africa's dignity. The revelation spread like wildfire. Within hours, whispers of the leaked memo rippled across African capitals. Headlines hit local newsrooms. Europe targets Africa's oil and gold. On social media, young voices asked the same question. How long will we let them dictate our future? In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré wasted no time. He summoned his advisors before dawn. The mood was tense, but steady. This isn't about tariffs, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. This is about control. They want our oil, our gold, and our sovereignty. If we bow today, we'll be slaves tomorrow. By mid-morning, emergency calls went out across the Sahel, Mali, Guinea, and beyond. Traoré demanded a gathering not of diplomats, but of leaders who understood what was at stake. Within days, a closed summit was underway. Not in Paris, not in Geneva, but in the heart of West Africa. Behind heavy doors, the air was thick with defiance. Each leader spoke of the same pattern. Gold siphoned out through shadow contracts. Oil fields dominated by foreign firms. Revenues disappearing overseas while villages remained in poverty. For the first time in decades, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about begging for aid. It was about standing together. And Traoré set the tone. If they dare impose tariffs, then we will dare something greater. We will shut down the flow of oil and gold to their markets. And we will find new partners who respect us. The room fell into silence. Then, one by one, leaders nodded. The decision was risky, dangerous even. But in that moment, Africa's fractured voices began to converge into a single unyielding answer. News of the summit's decision leaked quickly, not through official communiques, but through the voices of ordinary people. Radio stations carried fragments of speeches, and soon the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey were alive with chants. If they want our oil and gold, they'll have to take our dignity too. Markets buzzed with tension. Merchants whispered about the possibility of higher prices, about shortages that might come if Europe really raised tariffs. Farmers in dusty villages asked whether their harvests would still find buyers. Mothers worried about school fees, about medicine, about the thin line between survival and hunger. But something else burned beneath the fear. Pride. For decades, Africans had watched their oil drilled away, their gold shipped out. While they were told to be grateful for loans and aid, now, for the first time, their leaders were daring to say no. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a young student held a sign that read, "Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century." The crowd roared in agreement. Traoré understood the cost. He knew that freezing exports would tighten belts across the continent. Yet, when he appeared on national television, his words resonated deeper than any promise of comfort. We may suffer in the short term, but suffering with dignity is better than living forever on our knees. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. People who once felt powerless began to see themselves as part of a greater struggle across Africa. The whisper turned into a chorus. "Stand firm. We are with you." The shock inside Europe was immediate and undeniable. Markets that had long considered African resources as background noise suddenly realized they were staring into an abyss. In Frankfurt, traders watched gold prices climb like a rocket, their screens flashing red with each uptick. In Paris, energy planners quietly admitted that more than half of the uranium powering France's nuclear grid came from Niger, a lifeline now under question. And in Milan, executives from Europe's electric car industry gathered in a panic without cobalt and lithium from the Congo. Their factories would stall, their green revolution collapsing before it could even take root. But the most dangerous pressure point of all was oil and gold. African oil drawn from wells in the Sahel and shipped through the Gulf of Guinea kept Mediterranean refineries alive. African gold, much of it flowing through Burkina Faso and Mali, underpinned the financial security of entire banking systems. These two commodities were not luxuries. They were oxygen, and now Traoré had placed his hand firmly on the valve. In Brussels, ministers scrambled into late-night meetings. For years, they had spoken in public about partnership, about aid, about shared growth. Yet, the memos on their desks told a different story, one of dependency. Europe needed Africa far more than Africa needed Europe, and for the first time in decades, everyone in the room knew it. Inside the closed chambers of Brussels, the debate turned raw. Washington's voice dominated the call screens, insisting that Europe must stand united behind tariffs and financial restrictions. "Africa will crawl back," one American advisor declared, "once their treasuries run dry." But the Europeans in the room did not all nod. Some stared at graphs showing refinery shutdowns, bullion shortages, and cobalt contracts already slipping into Chinese hands. They knew that punishing Africa could boomerang with devastating speed. A German minister raised the first note of dissent. "Sanction them, and we sanction ourselves. Our auto industry cannot survive without Congolese cobalt. Our grids cannot run without Niger's uranium." His words hung heavy, but he did not dare push further. To openly oppose Washington's line would be political suicide. So instead, whispers of doubt spread quietly in corridors, never entering the official transcript. Meanwhile, opposition parties across Europe smelled blood. In Berlin, lawmakers asked why ordinary workers should pay the price of a tariff war against Africa. In Paris, unions warned of layoffs if gold markets were disrupted. Even in London, commentators on late-night programs began asking the unthinkable, have we underestimated Africa's power? But Trump's voice thundered above it all. At rallies broadcast globally, he promised to teach Africa its place, framing the crisis as a test of Western dominance. The crowd roared in approval, but diplomats listening abroad heard something different. The sound of a global order cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. As Europe wrestled with its divisions, BRICS nations moved with silent precision. In Beijing, trade officials announced emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks entirely. Moscow sent delegations offering joint ventures in gold, refining, and oil drilling, promising that no tariff could touch a barrel once it was rebranded under Eurasian contracts. New Delhi stepped forward with perhaps the boldest gesture, a pledge to purchase Sahelian crude in long-term agreements, guaranteeing a market even if Europe turned its back. Each step sent a clear signal. Africa would not stand alone. In Ouagadougou, these offers arrived like lifelines. Yet, Traoré and his allies in the alliance of Sahel states were cautious. They understood the stakes. Accepting outside deals too quickly could simply replace one dependency with another. So they moved deliberately. Teams of economists and engineers were dispatched to secure stockpiles of oil and gold. Border troops fortified mining zones, ensuring no sabotage could choke supply at its source. And in the heart of the summit, leaders began drafting a framework not for survival, but for sovereignty. An African resource charter that would treat oil, gold, and other raw materials not as commodities, but as instruments of independence. For decades, Africa had been forced to react, begging for aid, scrambling under sanctions, adjusting to terms set elsewhere. Now, for the first time, the continent was setting the rules of engagement. And as the lights in Brussels burned late into the night, Europe's leaders realized the unthinkable. The balance of power over oil and gold was no longer theirs to command. The counterattack did not arrive with tanks or missiles. It came quietly, cloaked in the language of finance and technology. Within days of Africa's Defiant Summit, European banks began freezing accounts linked to state-owned companies in Burkina Faso and Mali. Cargo ships loaded with crude oil and bullion were delayed in Mediterranean ports, their paperwork suddenly under review. Insurance firms, all based in Western capitals, refused to cover African shipments, leaving exporters stranded with barrels of oil and gold they could not move. Then came the digital assault. Anonymous cyber units probed government servers in Ouagadougou and Bamako, crashing websites, disrupting financial transfers, and targeting the very systems meant to safeguard resource flows. On television screens across Europe, a coordinated media campaign painted Traoré as reckless, a populist strongman dragging his nation into ruin. Editorials warned that Africa's gamble would end in hunger and chaos, and that ordinary Africans would turn against their leaders once the hardship bit deep. But the reality on the ground told another story. Yes, fuel prices rose. Medicines grew harder to find. Families felt the strain of shortages. Yet, rather than break under pressure, communities began to close ranks. Volunteers distributed food in rural villages. Students organized solidarity networks to keep schools running. Farmers pulled resources, ensuring harvests reached markets without relying on foreign intermediaries. What was meant to fracture Africa was paradoxically welding it together. The escalation came swiftly. Unmarked drones began circling over Sahelian skies, their shadows gliding across desert sands. Officially, they were monitoring operations, but everyone knew surveillance was just the beginning. In the coastal ports, shipments of African cocoa and coffee suddenly faced tariffs 3 times higher than before. What had once been celebrated as partnership commodities were now painted as bargaining chips in a brutal economic chess game. Inside African capitals, alarms rang daily. Electricity grids flickered after cyber strikes. Foreign contractors quietly abandoned infrastructure projects, claiming instability. Western embassies issued travel warnings, draining tourism revenue overnight. The pressure was designed not only to hit governments, but to sap morale, to convince ordinary citizens that resistance was futile. But Traoré saw through the pattern. At an emergency meeting of the AES, he told fellow leaders, "They are trying to turn our people against us. They believe hardship will break us, but hardship is not new to Africa. Dignity is." His words resonated deeply. AES responded with measures that startled observers. Resource convoys were now escorted by joint security forces. Local banks set up gold-backed payment systems to bypass Western transfers. Engineers in Niger and Mali worked overnight to stabilize grids, while Burkina Faso announced the creation of a national reserve fund stocked with oil and gold revenues. These were not desperate gestures. They were signals of resilience. The West wanted to corner Africa. Instead, Africa was learning how to stand on its own feet. And each failed attempt to fracture the continent only seemed to tighten the bonds that had once been fragile. The turning point came not from a battlefield, but from a broadcast. One evening, national television cut into regular programming to reveal Ibrahim Traoré standing at a simple podium. He was not flanked by generals in polished uniforms. Instead, around him stood miners still wearing dust-streaked overalls, farmers with calloused hands, and engineers in worn jackets. Together, they formed the backdrop of a different kind of power. Traoré's speech was clear, unpolished, and impossible to ignore. They say we are reckless. I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. From this day forward, they will no longer flow without dignity. The words cut across airwaves, carried by radios in villages, and streamed on smartphones in bustling cities. The reaction was electric. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight showing barrels of oil wrapped in African flags. In Kinshasa, marketplaces erupted in cheers when the speech replayed. Across the diaspora, young Africans posted one phrase, "If Traoré stands, we stand." Internationally, the fallout was immediate. Western media tried to spin the broadcast as defiant populism, but the imagery of workers standing shoulder to shoulder with their president resonated far beyond Africa. In South America, activists drew parallels with their own struggles against resource exploitation. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new axis of dignity. For Europe and the United States, the nightmare had materialized. The harder they tried to isolate Africa, the more its leaders appeared not as rebels, but as pioneers. The embargo had failed to fracture Africa. It had forged a new identity. Just when Europe believed the situation could not worsen, a new revelation hit like a thunderclap. An investigative report from the same anonymous European journalist who had exposed the tariff plan surfaced once more. This time it contained leaked correspondence, emails, and draft contracts between Western conglomerates and high-ranking officials. The documents revealed that long before the tariff strategy was announced, secret deals had already been drafted to privatize Africa's oil fields and gold mines under the guise of emergency stabilization programs. The language was chillingly blunt. Oil reserves in Niger were to be leased for 50 years to a consortium of Western firms at cut-rate prices. Gold from Burkina Faso would bypass African treasuries entirely, funneled directly into offshore accounts controlled from London. The plan was not about tariffs at all. It was about permanent control. When the story broke, outrage swept the continent. In Bamako, crowds stormed foreign company offices demanding accountability. In Ouagadougou, Traoré convened another emergency session, his voice measured but firm. Now the mask has fallen. This was never about fairness. It was theft disguised as policy. For ordinary Africans, the revelation hardened resolve. The sacrifices of high prices and shortages suddenly felt less like punishment and more like proof. Proof that their leaders were protecting them from a century-old pattern repeating itself. The fallout was immediate. European leaders scrambled to deny the documents, calling them fabrications. But the details were too precise, the figures too exact, the signatures too familiar. Financial analysts confirmed that draft contracts mirrored past arrangements used during the colonial era. For many in Africa, it was not shocking. It was confirmation of what their grandparents had always warned. The chains of dependency had only changed form. Traoré seized the moment. Standing before a packed hall of African parliamentarians, he declared, "They wanted to steal not just our oil and gold, but our future. If we allow this, then every sacrifice our people have endured is meaningless. But if we resist, we turn their theft into our rebirth." The chamber erupted in applause. Across the continent, momentum built. AES leaders announced a joint investigation into all foreign contracts signed in the last 2 decades. Protesters in Dakar, Lagos, and Kinshasa carried placards reading "No more hidden chains." Even diaspora communities in Paris and New York rallied demanding transparency from Western corporations. The narrative had shifted completely. What began as a tariff dispute had transformed into something larger, a referendum on Africa's right to control its own wealth. And for the first time in living memory, Africa was not on the defensive. It was the West that scrambled to explain itself. caught in the glare of its own hypocrisy. As the dust settled, one truth stood unshaken. Africa had stood its ground. What began as whispers of tariffs had erupted into a storm that exposed the depth of Western dependency and the lengths to which it would go to cling to control. Yet, against every sanction, every smear, every hidden contract, the continent had answered with unity. Burkina Faso's oil and gold were no longer symbols of plunder, but of power. They became the rallying cry of a generation that refused to kneel even in the face of hardship. Villages tightened belts, but dignity remained intact. And in that dignity, something new was born. The belief that Africa's future could be written not in foreign boardrooms, but in the hands of its own people. Standing before a sea of flags at the closing session of the AES summit, Traoré's voice carried across borders. They thought hunger would silence us. Instead, it awakened us. From this day forward, Africa is not a marketplace. They will meet us as equals or not at all. And as those words echoed, it was no longer just a speech. It was the beginning of a new chapter. If you believe Africa's dignity is worth more than gold, share this story.